All right, it's on mute, I believe. Everything's good to go. Cool. You are good to go.
Yeah, thanks.
Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. And today it's really my honor to introduce Dr. Nick Jewell, who really needs no introduction, but I will try my best. Dr. Nick Jewell is a professor of biostats and stats at School of Public Health at University of California, Berkeley. And since arriving at Berkeley in 1981, he has held various academic and administrative positions, and most notably serving as vice provost from 94 to 2000. And he has received numerous awards, more than the numbers that I could list here, but for example, the 2012 Marvin Zallen Leadership Award in Statistical Science from Harvard University. And his research interest includes statistical methods related to infectious disease, including AIDS, and biostatistical techniques in epidemiological data analysis and survival analysis and genomics. And without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Nick Jewell.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back in Seattle. My history with Seattle goes back a very, very long way. And Norm Brezel was very supportive when I first arrived in California, knew nothing, and he helped a great deal. So I'd owe a lot of thanks to people from the University of Washington. I feel a little bit embarrassed talking about this today because on every slide of this talk, there's someone who knows far more about the slide in the audience than I do. And I'm going to be somewhat, compounding that, I'm going to be somewhat superficial, which will annoy the experts, but just, I'm declaring that up front. I'm just going to be honest. Don't hold it against me. Because I want to cover ideas without losing anyone is my goal. And so just to give you a taste of some of the ideas we've been thinking about in connection with test-negative designs. Let's see if I can get this to work. Yeah. Let's see. Well, they promised me this would work, but stopped working.
Need to click in here first. Okay.
Right now. There we go. Thank you. What would we do without the IT experts? No thoughts. So I'm good. So the test-negative design, for those, I know there's people here who know far more about them than I do. So I'm just going to say, touch on a little bit of the history. They were really developed in connection with understanding influenza vaccines and their efficacy. And one of the sloppinesses I'm going to do throughout the talk is I'm going to not distinguish between efficacy and effectiveness. Some of you know what that distinction is, but just to avoid complications, I'm just going to use efficacy. And of course, vaccines are usually approved on the basis of large-scale randomized trials. That's the sort of prototype of how you would approve a vaccine. That's how the original influenza vaccines, when they were developed before some of you were born, that were developed on the basis of large-scale randomized trials. The COVID vaccine was developed and tested the same way. But influenza, as you know, gets modified every year because influenza mutates quickly. And so every year there tends to be different strains. And so you had the vaccine last year, it's probably not going to help you next year, because not because it wanes necessarily, but because the strains are different. So there's this guessing game that goes on at the WHO when they develop the vaccines as to what's going to be the prevailing strains throughout most of the world. and then they tell the vaccine manufacturers to make it. And nevertheless, and that's not tested on the basis of any randomized trial. But nevertheless, when you listen to the news or you go into your doctor's office or you read the newspapers about the influenza vaccine for this year, you'll usually read something that says this year's vaccine is 60% effective or 20% effective. They have some idea by the time it's made it to the US, because influenza moves through the world, the US isn't its first port of call, it's somewhere else. And so they know this. You hear these figures. So where do those figures come from? Because they're not doing a randomized trial every year for the new influenza vaccine. So the question I'm putting out for those of you who don't know the answer, it's not like giving a talk to people where half the people know the answer and half the don't. So I'm talking to people who don't know the answer, is how would you go about designing statistical analysis of determining the effectiveness of the current influenza vaccine each year, so that we would have some idea to convey to people whether this was worth taking or not. And of course, as I said, we don't do large-scale randomized trials. And think of the parallels with the COVID vaccine, where now everyone's familiar with the COVID vaccines. And hopefully everyone in here has had at least one of them. Same issue. They were developed and tested based on large-scale randomized trials, but there's no real current large-scale randomized trials testing the new boosters or the new iterations of the vaccine, or how it's effective against new variants because the virus is mutating. But people are interested in these questions. How effective is the current booster? Should I have it? Is it better to get the Moderna vaccine or the Pfizer vaccine or something else? Is the vaccine I had 3 months ago that was developed for the Omicron variant still going to be effective now that the Omicron variant isn't prevailing? So there are all these questions still. And we kind of like to know the answers to these, but we're not going to do randomized trials for them because it would be impossible. And in fact, if you think about comparing the effectiveness of a single vaccine against different variants, you can't randomize the variant. So you can't do a randomized trial to answer that question. So these questions are all out there, and you've probably seen answers to some of these questions. You might ask, well, where did this information come from? How did they do that? So you're going to need some form of observational study, which is not great for statisticians because randomized studies have such a huge advantage over observational studies for reasons we all should be familiar with. For example, comparison of the vaccine, COVID vaccine across variants is probably less subject to observational bias than comparison of the vaccines themselves, because people can pick which vaccine they get. It's very hard for people to pick which variant they're going to be exposed to. So you can't really. So there's an interesting question. You're forced into an observational study. How do you do it? So the question is, how do you design such a study? And that's been around from the time of the influenza vaccine. I'm not going to answer that question yet. The answer is in the title of the talk, obviously. The test-negative design was designed to answer some of these questions for influenza. But I want to change now. I knew nothing about test-negative designs 5 or 6 years ago because I didn't work in influenza. But I was working or starting to work on dengue, which is a completely different disease. Presumably I'll tell you a little bit about dengue. But again, if there's an expert in dengue in the room, forgive me, because I'm going to butcher a brief description of dengue. It's a mosquito-borne virus, largely transmitted by one species of mosquito, Aedes aegypti, different species of mosquito that transmits malaria, but prevalent in much the same parts of the world that malaria exists. It's the most rapidly spreading infectious disease in the world, and very rapidly over the last 40 or 50 years. Largely because of global warming, probably. Because the habitat where Aedes aegypti thrives is expanding as the earth warms. Aedes aegypti likes warm climates, it likes damp conditions, and that's more prevailing across bigger parts of the world now. So about half the world is subject to dengue. Not here in Seattle yet, but it's coming. Maybe not in Ross's lifetime, but maybe in the youngest person in the room's lifetime. I'll be gone. There's a lot of infections, around 400 million dengue infections a year. Dengue is, there's 4 different viruses that are called dengue. One, not really creatively named, 1, 2, 3, 4. And when you get dengue, I've never had it, so I can not speak from personal experience, but when you get it, it's kind of like COVID or bad case of influenza. It's not pleasant. You really feel sick for a while, like you do with a bad case of influenza, but you don't usually die from it, fortunately. But there's a cross-immunity reaction associated with these 4 viruses. You get immunity when you're infected, pretty much lifelong immunity, but only to that one specific serotype, that one of the 4 that you got. When you get then exposed to a different version, different variant, different serotype, there's a cross-immunity reaction, which I will not try to explain, which creates much more serious illness, potentially hemorrhagic conditions, and often fatal. Most of people who get dengue in the world where they're exposed to it get it when they're young, as children. They're naive when they're born. And so this is a real threat to young people. So this is not a disease like influenza that just picks off old people. It does pick off old people, but most old people who have survived that long have had all 4 in endemic countries and so are immune. So it picks off young people. So it's a really serious problem. About 25,000 deaths per year, going up now every year. And it's a really crisis in the world right at this minute. So in Puerto Rico, there's currently a public health emergency. It's not COVID, it's dengue. Andrea's just come from Argentina, right? Very, very bad in Argentina. Brazil, terrible in Brazil right now. Paraguay, overwhelmed, hospitals overwhelmed with dengue. Peru, terrible right now for dengue. So it's a serious, serious problem. Here's the parts of the world that are impacted largely. So there's Argentina's in there, Brazil, and Central America, most of Africa, India, China, these Asian islands, and the north part of Australia. That's largely, as I say, because this is the habitat for Aedes aegypti. So you can see the United States, not too bad, right? Florida. And there are cases in all throughout the United States, but it's almost unilaterally everywhere else. When people travel, they get bitten by a mosquito, they come home, they get really sick. The doctor doesn't know what's going on. So finally somebody thinks, where have you been? And it can be dengue, but it doesn't then get transmitted to another human because there are no Aedes aegypti around, except in Florida, which is fairly recent, and in California. Now this map is, pointing, yeah. This map is about 5 or 10 years old. So this has crept up to about here now. And so California, they're in the Central Valley, Aedes aegypti. And so there is the potential, since dengue is not endemic, there's not a lot of people running around currently in California with dengue. But if someone travels to Argentina, not looking at anyone in particular, and then comes to California with dengue and gets bitten, that mosquito can then transmit it to the rest of us who are living in California. And so this is creeping up. So it will hit Seattle because it's creeping up until the world starts cooling. Aedes aegypti are going to just keep moving up higher and higher. So what's the current strategy? Is this going to be a sweeping generalization? So with, dengue is in the same family of viruses as the Zika virus. And those of you who remember the Olympics and the World Cup in Brazil will remember that was a threat to those events. And you saw in the pictures on the TV, the Brazilian authorities going around spraying neighborhoods with these people with white suits on, and they're spraying everything. That's the standard methods to try and kill off the mosquitoes. Removing habitat, Aedes aegypti is incredibly effective. So it's not just having large pools of water in your garden. If you have a little cap from a bottle, a water bottle, and it falls into the street and it rains, and so a little bit of water gets in there, probably about 10,000 Aedes aegypti will come out of that little cap. They're very effective at breeding. So it's very hard to control the habitat. You really have to be extraordinarily effective to remove it. So personal insecticides, bed nets might be effective. Bed nets are not so useful for Aedes aegypti as they are for most mosquitoes, because bed nets, by their definition, protect you when you're sleeping. When most mosquitoes bite, you think of going out at dusk for your barbecue and the mosquitoes come, right? We all know that experience. But Aedes aegypti tends to feed at midday. So it fools you. It's not the same as typical mosquitoes. And they don't make that whirring, that annoying whining sound that mosquitoes make. Aedes aegypti is silent. So you don't know it. You hear that sound for other mosquitoes. You don't hear it too much with Aedes aegypti. So they're not terribly effective. And there is a vaccine. Actually, there are now at least 2 vaccines developed for, I'm not that familiar with the new one, but the Sanofi one was the original one called Dengvaxia. It was approved for use in a bunch of countries where dengue was prevalent. It's about 60% effective based on a big, large randomized trial given to young people because they are the people at risk. It was suspended for use largely because of cross-immunity reaction. That the same thing happened with the vaccine, that when they gave it to kids, you can see 9 to 45, a lot of kids were getting it. If the kid had never had dengue at that age and they were vaccinated, but then they had a breakthrough infection, and you could see breakthrough infections were not uncommon. It was only 60% effective, so a fair number. So that's pretty good for a vaccine. I'd certainly use a 60% effective vaccine. But the problem here was for those 40% of kids who got infected, even though they'd been vaccinated and had never seen dengue before, they got much, much sicker than someone who wasn't vaccinated and got dengue for the first time. And some kids died, and oh my God, if you thought the politics about COVID vaccine were complicated and side effects, it was very complicated. And they removed it in several markets. There's a new vaccine that they're developing. The other method is much more modern, is some form of genetic modification or gene drive modifications to the mosquito that will change its ability to transmit dengue. That's not yet ready. It's not ready to be off the shelf, but it's being developed, and they're doing this for malaria too. And sometimes they'll do gene drives that's not only targeted at transmission, but targeted to kill the mosquito or make it infertile before adulthood, basically, to try and suppress the population. So that's a good idea, and it's just not quite there yet. And then there's the last one, which was the one I was involved in, which is Wolbachia deployment of mosquitoes, which is very counterintuitive. So the Wolbachia solution is to go into neighborhoods, breed lots of mosquitoes, and pour those mosquitoes out into the neighborhood, which sounds like a terrible thing to do because those mosquitoes go and bite people. And so the households see you coming with the buckets of larvae, put it outside their front door. They see the mosquitoes coming out a week later. That's supposed to help? Well, it does. And I'll tell you why it helps if you don't know the answer to that. So what is Wolbachia? It's named after an entomologist called Walbach. It's a naturally occurring bacteria. It lives inside insect cells. It does not live in mammals. So it's a bacteria that doesn't occur in mammals at all, only in insects. But about 60% of all insect species you can find them with some of them with Wolbachia, this bacteria. And, you know, bacteria are prevalent. It's what's known as a symbiotic bacteria. It's not a bacteria that we think of as, oh my God, let's get some antibacterial soap. We've got to kill this thing. It doesn't do you any harm. It doesn't do the insect any harm. It's a symbiotic bacteria. And everyone in this room has thousands of symbiotic bacteria in you right now, quite happily living in you. In fact, you are more bacteria than you are human. So if I were to dissolve you and count your cells, you have more bacterial cells than you have human cells. So you're really just walking bacteria. But most of them are symbiotic. In fact, if I take those bacteria away from you, as a child, let's just have children in a sterile environment so they don't get all these bacteria, they die. We don't know that about children because we've never been allowed to do that experiment, but we do know it about mice. They die. So we need these bacteria. They're symbiotic. They help us, and almost all the bacteria in humans are helpful. They digest your food. They protect you from nasty bacteria, and so they're good. And you can't live without them. Wolbachia is one of those kind, but it's an insect version. And I won't get distracted as to what it's doing for the insect, but they live happily in coexistence. Can't be transmitted to your cat, so at least we don't have that worry. If you bring the Wolbachia mosquito to your household, it's not going to infect your cat and turn it into a zombie or something. No mammals. So in principle, completely safe for humans and animals and the environment. Does not kill the mosquito. It shortens their lifespan a little bit. And the original development for Wolbachia was thinking that it might shorten lifetime and they died before they produce, and that would be a suppression tactic. It doesn't really work. And so it seemed like a failed experiment until someone noticed something in the lab about Wolbachia. Well, before I get to that, how do you get these Wolbachia? It did not exist in Aedes aegypti. It did exist naturally in some other mosquitoes, but not in Aedes aegypti. No Aedes aegypti in the world had Wolbachia. And so the real breakthrough was someone in the lab figuring out how to transinfect a living mosquito with Wolbachia so that it could be transmitted through reproduction to the offspring. And that was tricky scientifically, technically. It took about 10 or 15 years. Someone finally made the breakthrough in a lab in Australia, and they did it. And once you got one, you could start breeding it. I won't go through the breeding, but once you've got it into the female, it transmits to all their offspring automatically. You don't have to do anything. It just transmits it instantly. So the idea of the Wolbachia intervention, like I say, is you go to households in a neighborhood or a place, village, city, and you place these buckets of larvae. The larvae develop, the mosquitoes are hatched with Wolbachia. They start mating with the wild mosquitoes because they're perfectly attractive to the other mosquitoes. It made no difference. And within about 2 to 3 months, more than 90% of the mosquitoes in that environment have Wolbachia because there's a selective advantage I won't talk about. So it's very quick. And this is actually a sort of a schematic of real data from Australia where they tested this. Here's the situation at the beginning, all wild mosquitoes in red. You start releasing, and pretty sure after 12 weeks, you're pretty high. Within a few more weeks, pretty much every mosquito has Wolbachia because they're fairly short lifespan for mosquitoes and their reproductive cycle is quick.
How much does it take in green to eventually take over?
Well, it doesn't take much.
Something?
No, I mean, if you do it locally, it doesn't take much locally, but mosquitoes don't travel very far in their lifetime. So if you just dump one bucket here, maybe in the room, every mosquito in the room would get it, but in the next room, since mosquitoes don't travel.
You're better off to get small buckets widely distributed.
Exactly, you have to do it. But the key compared to the other intervention I talked about, you only have to do it once. So the longest data is from Australia, in the northern part of Australia that I noted on the map. 15 years later, it's still well over 90% of all mosquitoes still have Wolbachia. No more releases. The releases were done 15 years ago. It doesn't go away. And there's other, I'm simplifying things, I'm being sloppy, but I'm not going to be distracted.
It looks like the total number of mosquitoes is actually declining following the introduction of this.
Not much, not much. It doesn't really suppress much. Again, you're taking it to a complicated story, which I don't want to talk about. But the males become infertile if they try and mate. If they have Wolbachia and they try and mate with a wild female, they don't have offspring. Their offspring are not viable. So it has a slight suppression on the number of species, but it does not eradicate at all the mosquito population. So there's no ecological impact because some birds and other things depend on mosquitoes. So that's the problem with the idea, let's just eradicate the mosquito. Because I mean, it's the one animal in the world that has killed the most humans over human history, is the mosquito. But so why not eradicate it like we did with grizzly bears or, you know, other things that were nasty to humans? There'd probably be ecological consequences to doing that. So that's an advantage here. You're not really interrupting the ecology. You're just giving them this nice friendly mosquito bacteria to carry around with them. So the key finding in the lab when they realized it didn't suppress was, lo and behold, it stopped the reproduction of the dengue virus in the gut of the mosquito bites you, picks up the dengue virus from an infected human. The virus transmits from its mouth, gets replicated in the gut, and when that mosquito goes and bites your partner the next night in the same room, the virus gets transmitted. But Wolbachia, for reasons I'm not going to get into, blocks that entirely. Not entirely, there's nothing perfect in life. You can see, I just moved the slide. You have 70, 80, 90% blocking of the replication of dengue. So suddenly the idea was, wait, if it's blocking, maybe this darn mosquito won't infect the next human then, if that mosquito has Wolbachia. And that's the idea. That was the genesis of the idea as an intervention. Well, it's going to get even better. You guys are perfect at heart disease trials, cancer trials. You're testing one treatment for one kind of cancer, and you're just thrilled if it works for one kind of cancer, if it has any impact at all. This thing is magic, because it doesn't just protect you against dengue. It has similar blocking capabilities against other viruses. And there are a lot of viruses spread by Aedes aegypti. So it blocks all four, as you saw, all four serotypes sort of equally. So it works universally. It blocks yellow fever, which was a terrible killer in the United States, in Texas and so on. Before we now have a yellow fever vaccine. Some of you may have had that yellow fever vaccine. If you've gone to Africa, probably had yellow fever vaccine. Wolbachia blocks it. It blocks the West Nile virus. It blocks chikungunya. It blocks Zika. One treatment, all of it eradicated at once, and a few others. These are all viruses of a certain kind of family, so there's a similar mechanism going on. It's blocking them all. So the question then is, going back to the question, how do you test the efficacy of influenza and COVID vaccines in a world where you're not going to do randomized trials? How are we going to test the efficacy of this? That was the question I got involved with, a group of people sort of brainstorming. How are we going to test this in the field to make sure it works? So this is a little bit different from a vaccine because you can't give each individual their personal mosquitoes to carry around and protect them. So it's going to be some sort of cluster intervention, which most vector control trials are done. So how do we do it? So this is just a brainstorming, this is sort of reflecting the brainstorming. How do you do it when it's in, most of the infections are in children or youth. So it's no point doing this and doing it in the full adult population because most of them are immune if you're going to any of these countries. It's very hard to establish and follow a cohort of children for 2 or 3 years. And by the way, dengue is very seasonal. It can have years where it's very, very low. And then years like now in Argentina, where it's incredibly high. So you could do a trial and go for a couple of years and there'd be literally very little dengue. So it's a tricky trial to try and design. Yeah, and you got, but you don't know when. It's very hard to predict. You're gonna have to follow these kids. If you're gonna measure infection, you're probably gonna have to do blood draws. You can do a blood test to see if an infection has occurred. And you're gonna have to do a lot of blood draws on these kids over a 2 or 3 year period, every few months, maybe even every month. Can you imagine? So that didn't seem appealing as a trial.
You can't do what we did in COVID, where you basically look for defining symptoms and then you do confirmation.
You could wait, you could just wait for symptomatic disease. There's a fair amount of asymptomatic, particularly for first infections. As I said, it's kind of like the flu. Hard to distinguish necessarily. So there's a lot of flu going on, a lot of colds. So the parents have to come in to have blood draws. Is this really dengue? So there's a lot of blood drawing on a lot of young kids, which isn't a great idea or hard to persuade. So that's when we were sitting around designing this, we designed what I didn't know at the time, because it's like when you invent anything, there's nothing new under the sun. And we invented the test negative design. We didn't know it at the time because we weren't influenza people in the room. So this was the idea, is that you wait for people to get sick and you recruit sick people in a clinic or in a clinical setting with symptoms compatible to dengue. So it's it mimics to some extent many viral infections. You get high fever and various other viral complications. So it's to determine whether someone has dengue, you have to do a definitive blood test. But it's like, it can even mimic influenza, particularly for first infections. But the idea is you get these people, they come in, their parents bring them in, the kids in, they're usually kids, they're sick, and you recruit them. You get with all the usual informed consent, so on, you get them to participate. They don't know what they've got, you test them. Testing is not done routinely for clinical reasons, because by the time you get the result, the passage of disease, there's nothing you can do really to intervene anyway on dengue, other than giving people fluids and keeping them comfortable. There's no treatment. But at that point, you ask them their exposure status. So thinking now of the test negative in the influenza setting, what you do is you set up a clinic, people come in with influenza-like symptoms, which the CDC measures all the time, how much people are showing up with flu-like symptoms. They then take a formal test if it's influenza, and they ask the person at the time of recruitment, before the person knows what they've got, hey, were you vaccinated for flu this year or not? So they ask them that question, then they get the result of the test a week later, and they compare the odds of vaccination amongst those who really truly turned out to have influenza to the odds of vaccination amongst those who turned out not to have influenza at the time of the recruitment. So then the test, that's where they come. The test positives for the outcome, in the case of influenza. In the case of dengue, it was dengue. And the intervention there was, were you exposed to Wolbachia? And I'll come to that, how we expose people to Wolbachia in a minute. But the key advantage to this approach is, because it's an observational study, think influenza again, there's a big, hopefully reducing confining due to health-seeking behavior. Because people who are, whatever that means, healthcare seekers, people who tend to want to be proactive about taking care of the health are more likely to be vaccinated and more likely to show up in a clinic. Because that's their nature of their personalities. And so if you don't adjust for that in the general population, you have a potential of confounding. But this is only seeking people who show up at the clinic. And both, whether you're positive or negative, you both showed up and you don't know which you had. So they should be identical in terms of their behavior, at least in seeking care. You can measure movement at the time of symptoms. So you can actually measure something. What were you doing in the last 10 days? If it turns out to be dengue, we kind of like to know what you were doing. And since you get the person at the time of symptoms appearing, you get their memory right then, rather than doing blood draws and saying, oh, this kid was infected with dengue, but it could have been any time in the last 3 months. So we don't know when. When do we ask them about what they were doing? So it's advantageous that way. and it's efficient. It's not really a case control design, but you are waiting for people to get sick. So if you do a cohort, 95% of your cohort never gets sick during the 2 years you're following them. So you have a lot of inefficiency built in, but here you only are looking at sick people. So you don't have to wait as long. It's more efficient design. Okay. Of course, there's no free lunch. You have to make assumptions for this to work. The key assumption is that the intervention does not impact the test negative. So when we were doing the dengue trial, it was in Indonesia, we couldn't have people, if someone turned out to have Zika, we couldn't include them because Wolbachia would have an impact in protecting you from Zika. So they had to be thrown out. It had to be something that's not affected by the vaccine. So for influenza, it'd have to be other respiratory conditions. You have to make the assumption the influenza vaccine doesn't impact. And I'll come back to that question for influenza right at the end. So there's the assumption for influenza. I'll come back to it. The idea is that Wolbachia doesn't affect other febrile illnesses, the test negative conditions where they're coming in. That seems pretty reasonable. And then it's fine if the intervention influences enrollment. So, you know, this study that we did was unblinded. So you might argue that people in the intervention area either sought less healthcare or more healthcare, depending which way you think. It doesn't matter if that happens, as long as it's not modified by the test results. The test positives can't be seeking healthcare more than the test negatives. That would bias things, but that's not likely to happen since when they come in, the whole point they're coming in is they don't know if they're test positive or test negative. So how can that have influenced their decision? And of course, there's an assumption here. You're only seeing people who come to a clinic. You don't see a population, anyone in the population who wouldn't seek healthcare for their kids. In the United States, that might be a problem if they didn't have healthcare insurance, for example. They might not seek healthcare. You wouldn't see those people because they're not enrolled. You have to make an assumption that the effect of the intervention in the healthcare seekers is equivalent to intervention in the others. And you want a good test. Okay, so I said this, that the test negative design was designed really to remove confounding by healthcare seeking behavior. And I know there's a lot of causal inference people in the audience. I'm not going to talk about it, but I'm just going to throw some graphs up just to make you sit up and wake up for a second. Maybe now I can see some eyes, you know. Oh, causal inference, okay. And there's been quite a lot of work done on this in trying to do that, because healthcare seeking behavior is really not a binary characteristic, 0, 1. And is it truly, you know, if you look at the causal diagram, is it truly removing all confounding? Well, there's a whole bunch of stuff on this, and there's some references. This was a paper by Sheena Sullivan and Eric Check. And so there's a lot written about this, that if you're interested from a causal inference point of view, it's a fertile area of, here you go, like, look at them all these little causal diagrams, healthcare seeking behavior. And, you know, there's a selection going on because you're only selecting people who have symptoms. So if you like causal diagrams and that kind of causal inference, you can have a go at it. And I just wanted to make a point here. Some of you I know are working on proximal inference ideas. So there's an interesting idea that I think largely came from Eric's group about double negative control studies. In addition to have a test control outcome, you have a test control exposure. An exposure which you know does not affect the outcome of interest. And you use that to remove unmeasured confounding. So you have both a negative control exposure and a negative control outcome. And that can take you further. But again, this is superficial. I'm not going to get distracted by it. But if you're interested, I know some of you are, then there's a lot starting to be written about that. So it's a fertile area. So now I want to tell you how we did adapt this. So we didn't know we were adapting the test negative design at the time, but how did we adapt it for this dengue study? So we did cluster randomization. So we took a large city in Indonesia, Yogyakarta. It's in Java, same island as Jakarta, but much smaller. It's about the size of Oakland, I always say. You probably don't know what the size of Oakland is, but it's small, a little bit smaller than Seattle, but not enormously smaller. divided it into, I'll show you the regions in a minute, about 26 regions. And that number there was really determined by how you deployed the mosquitoes and how much movement there was in natural boundaries and so on. And for each, and half of the clusters were exposed to Wolbachia and half weren't. And we just did this here. And here's the, but here, before I get into that further for the cluster, here's the statistics behind the original test negative design. So here's the healthcare seeking population. There's some of them are exposed to the intervention, whether it's vaccination or whatever it is. Some aren't. Some of those never get sick because they either weren't exposed or they just didn't get sick. And you don't see those people because they didn't get sick. The test negative design, you have to get sick to be enrolled. See, these are the people who get sick. Some of them turned out to be positive, and some of them turned out to be negative. So this is the red boxes to see. That's what you see. What you really like to know is the incidence amongst the people who had the intervention, A over NI, and the same thing for the controls, G over NC. Then you take the ratio of those, and that would give you the relative risk. That's what you'd like. The trouble is you don't know what NI and NC are, because you need to know not only the size of the population, but you need to know the size of the population who would seek care counterfactually if their kid got sick, kind of thing. And you don't really know how to estimate that. But the idea behind that assumption that the intervention does not affect the test negative conditions allows you to assume that if being test negative is independent of the intervention, then B over NI and H over NC should be roughly the same. If they weren't the same, that would be saying somehow the intervention was influencing who gets the test negative condition. And the assumption is it doesn't have any influence at all. So you assume this. And once you make this assumption, all you need is the ratio of NI over NC, and you get this from B over H. So if you plug that in, you get the odds ratio from that red table. The odds ratio is actually estimating the relative risk. It's really estimating this quantity here. I've just called it lambda because I think in the slides, if you want to, I don't write RR. And so this is akin to, actually a little bit akin to case cohort studies. It's like a little bit like a case control study, but amongst the controls are not true controls, meaning they never get the disease. They're really a sample of the entire population, and you're getting the frequency of the exposure amongst the entire population. So it's, and we all know, because Ross has told us, that in a case cohort study, the odds ratio estimates the relative risk. So that's really, it's really that same argumentation going on here. Okay, so that just, I'm going to stop about Wolbachia. I'll come back to it in the last, I've got about 5 or 10 more minutes. So here's the, this was used a lot for COVID vaccine, not after the first trials, how you measured the effectiveness of the vaccines and comparing head to head the different vaccines and so on. There were a lot of test negative designs. This happened to be one in California that I was involved in. So, you know, you got these nice pictures of when did you get the dose? And here was, you know, various characteristics of the population, trying to measure the vaccine effectiveness. And also by outcome. You have to define what you mean by symptoms, so you can define that very loosely. Symptoms, or you could be very stringent and say you have to be hospitalized for us to recruit you, or you have to die for us to recruit you. You're getting measures of effectiveness against different outcomes. And I just want to point out one thing here. I think it's, yeah. In this study, some people were tested because they had symptoms, just like I described the test negative design, but some people just got tested. I don't think there's probably a person in this room who hasn't been tested at a point where even they didn't have any symptoms. By God, I was tested yesterday. I didn't have any symptoms, but Marco forced me to be tested. So if I did that in a healthcare setting, I might be recruited. And is that an issue? It's a big issue, actually, in these test negative designs. That follows things up, actually. I'll come back to that very briefly. Here is the trial in dengue. So I'm flipping back now to dengue. Here's Jewell-Test-negative, and here you can see the the 24 clusters, the green where the Wolbachia was placed, pretty much block by block in there and deployed, and we waited 3 or 4 months, trapping mosquitoes to make sure the Wolbachia had established and so on. And in the gray areas, no Wolbachia. It was, I won't get into this, it was constrained randomization because we wanted the green areas to not be that dissimilar just by chance to have turned out to be the top of the city versus the bottom. So there was constrained randomization, population size was part of the constraining, and so on. I won't get into that detail. So this was different from the traditional test menu. So at some point, at NIAID, I triggered, oh, there's this test-negative design. This looks exactly what we're doing. But we have clustering here, which is not typical for influenza. There's no clustering because people have individual choices for vaccine. And we did this randomly. That was a big ask for the city to allow us to randomly deploy mosquitoes. And in fact, in Colombia, in Medellin, they wouldn't let us do randomized experimentation. Just something, politicians don't like the idea of saying, can I randomize an intervention to half your population? What's the randomization? Well, we want to release mosquitoes that will bite you. So that we did here. They did buy into it.
At WHO for probably in 2021, as you were thinking about new vaccines, doing randomized deployment and basically randomizing green areas and gray areas. Everybody was going to get it, but it was how soon you got it.
Yeah, it's like a step wedge in a sense. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, we did that in Medellin actually in the end. I was smart enough to ask the politicians, okay, I understand you, we can't randomize. Do you care which area? I just naively said, do you care which area we do first or second? Oh no, we don't care. So I randomized that. It's not bad. It's not good. So this is the interesting thing. When I walked away from designing this, before I knew it was test negative, I thought, this is really interesting. This is like a case control sampling to ascertain disease, but you've randomized the exposure. This has to have been done somewhere else. I've never really seen an example anywhere where there's been a randomized exposure, but then you ascertain effectiveness, you do case control sampling. That is kind of nice because you get the benefits of randomization, but you also get the efficiency gains of doing sort of case control sampling. I'm running out of time. So here's the clustering thing. Here you have to do this red table cluster by cluster. And it's kind of interesting here. In each of these 2x2 tables, one row is zeros. Because in each cluster, either everyone is exposed to the intervention or no one is. So you either see A and B, or you see G and H. And you have to put it, so you can't get the odds ratio for any given cluster, but you have to aggregate things across that. And I did that in the end by permutation test because I wanted to rely entirely on randomization. I didn't want any model in sight, just complete permutation. I won't go into the details. And you can do some, if you learn about finite sampling, you can figure out what the odds ratios distribution will look like under the permutation distribution approximately, very, very accurately. So you can do things like confidence intervals. And here's the result of the trial. It was spectacularly successful. The moment I saw this, I planned retirement because I couldn't beat this ever again. It was 71%. Oh no, that's 77% effective. A 77% reduction in dengue in the treated areas compared to the untreated. 86% reduction in hospitalizations due to dengue. So hugely, way beyond our wildest dreams. And fortunately, because the trial had to be stopped early, guess what? Because of COVID. But we had enough by then to get these fairly reasonable confidence intervals. Dengue 3 was not that prevalent, so it's a much wider confidence interval. Another way of visualizing those results was just to look at in each cluster, what was the fraction of all the participants enrolled who had dengue versus who tested negative. And overall, if you think there were far more test negatives than test positives, if you think that's R, but you could plot those proportions. And here's the intervention clusters here, and here's the control clusters here. And all but one, there's separation. I won't get distracted as to what was different about this one. And you can then compare the average of these proportions across the two arms, basically doing a t-test. And that difference in that average, it actually relates to the relative risk. There's a little algebra involved in that. Once you know the overall ratio of the number of test negatives to test positives, and you know T, then you know the relative risk. And you got almost the same, that's a quadratic in lambda. You can solve that. You get almost exactly the same estimate as just using the odds ratio, the aggregate odds ratio. I'm not going to go through this because I'm running out of time. There's slight improvements on that, but it's not necessary. Okay, so just in the, can I have 2 or 3 more minutes? Is that okay? It's fine if you say no, because I'm happy to stop anytime. I don't like giving talks, so, I'm happy to stop. Of course, there was some movement of the mosquitoes. We were trapping every month, and they did drift a little bit over time. The wind picks up mosquitoes and they drift a little bit. But more importantly, the damned humans kept moving. So a kid was in a treated area, but darn if the parents didn't send them to school across the river in a place where there was no Wolbachia. But we knew where they had been the last few weeks. So we knew how much Wolbachia was wherever they were living, and we knew where they had been. And you could create from that, I won't get into the details, but you could create from that exposure indices. And we had a couple. One was based on both the human movement and the prevalence of the mosquito where you were moving to, and one was just based on the Wolbachia area where you lived, because most people get infected in their homes or in their gardens around. Okay, and so to do a naive, don't look at me, causal inference people. I'm not looking at you. Let's just take this measure of exposure and do a logistic regression or something to see if that changes the results. And okay, how do you do that? So naively, you think, well, I could do a random effects model, or I could do GE, a marginal model. Okay, sounds good. So here's the marginal models. Oh, I've got to do that darn working correlation, right? Remember this stuff 35 years ago? You taught me about this. Okay. The working correlation is kind of a nuisance. You think you might get a little extra precision by being smart about the working correlation, but it shouldn't affect the estimator. It should just affect the variance. But look at the difference in the results. Oops. If I used independence, I got 81% effective. If I used exchangeable, which would seem like more reasonable, I only got 29% effectiveness. I didn't want to show this to anyone. But what's this? This looks like the worst thing all our clinical colleagues think about statistics, right? They look, oh my God, the answer depends on some stupid esoteric statistical assumption. And similar with the other one. So if you did random effects, not quite so bad, but still pretty, I won't worry about the random intercepts and slopes, but you still didn't get very good result. You got 30% efficacy and odds ratio, a relative risk of 0.7 or 0.5, depending on this, but nothing close to what we had done, we published or were about to publish for the overall. And so what the heck is going on here, guys? I would sort of think, what's going on? You guys are all experts. What's going on here? Well, and by the way, the random effects models led to estimates closer to the null than the marginal, which is the exact opposite of what I had been teaching for 10 years, that it was the other way around. When you do cluster-specific effects, they tend to be more extreme, away from the null. So what's the heck's going on? I thought I was an expert. I've always known I'm not an expert in anything, and so I knew what's going on here. Well, it could be a misspecified regression. All I did was put the regression, the exposure, and maybe that's not a good model. I wasn't doing model-based analysis before. And then there's GE bias, which is a University of Washington product, right, from Margaret Pepe, is popping up here because to do GE, if you're really paying attention, you have to have this result. I won't get into technical detail because the time is short, but this is basically saying that conditioning on someone else in the cluster doesn't affect the regression of my outcome on my exposure. And most cases, that's probably reasonable, but in a lot of cases, it isn't. In this case, it really might not be. In an infectious disease setting, that might not be reasonable. So that suggests that what you have to do is you have to control for that. So what essentially you're doing controlling for both these issues. So what we did was put in a within class, that's a within person, the actual exposure of the person, but also the average for their cluster. So it was before we were just putting in the first term, this term here. This is measuring the within cluster effect, and this is essentially a between cluster effect because the average for the cluster is a cluster constant. And if you do that, you get much nicer results. Immediately do that, you get no difference between the independence and exchangeable. And now you're getting 94% effectiveness. So it is suggesting that some of the estimate that we published, which was 78% effective, it's diluted a little bit because of this movement. Cut a long story short. And now, by the way, the marginal and the random effects behave the way you'd think them to. I'll just go through these slides very quickly. Other things that immediately appeared from this is you could do a lot to understand more than the overall causal effect. You could look at how cases clustered. And here was the map of all the dengue cases. Not the controls aren't on here, but the dengue cases are here, and the gray areas are the treated. If you look at that and squint a little bit, you can see there's less cases in the gray area than the white. We're not accounting for population density or anything, but that's what the results show. That's true. And the question we wanted to ask is there less clustering in the gray? There are some cases in the treated areas. Is there less clustering? And the answer to that, oh, but by the way, no, that's just, I won't go into that. Yeah, there's less clustering. Yes, there is less clustering. And the huge advantage of the test negative design is here, when you're looking at these spatial point processes, normally this is all you see. You just see cases of leukemia, childhood leukemia, and maybe there's a power plant or something you're thinking, is there something to do? But you don't know what the controls are, right? Because there is no control. But the test negative design, you automatically have a control. And so you can look at the controls as a sort of a template for what clustering might be occurring just because of population density. I don't think I'll talk about proximal cases. That came to the same thing. I'm just going to jump over those slides. For those of you doing cluster randomized trials, another thing was there spillover effects, which are a little bit captured by the exposure, but did the efficacy of the intervention work a little bit in the control clusters around the boundary, or in the reverse? If you were in an intervention area but lived close to control, did it lose some of its effectiveness? Right? It's like half your house is protected and the other backside wasn't. That's an exaggeration, but and what we did there was use a method that was developed out of LSHTM, which was we expanded the size of the intervention clusters by 50 meters on the map. There's a fair amount of coding, I should say, because you have to take the map and expand it and reclassify people as being in the intervention cluster if they were within 50 meters and so on. And then did the reverse, expand the control. And the idea was if there's no spillover effect, if you do that, you're misclassifying exposure a little bit. So you should ameliorate the effect, make the effect closer to the null if there's a spillover. Sorry, if there's no spillover. And that's exactly what happened. You can see here where this was the original result. As soon as we started expanding the control or the intervention cluster, we made the efficacy drift towards zero, suggesting there's no spillover.
You don't know how to fly.
They do, but they don't fly very far.
You don't fly.
A mosquito in its lifetime, this room is about its lifespan, unless it's windy.
But people do.
People move, but the mosquitoes don't. Spillover is really getting at not the human movement, is getting at the mosquitoes drifting across the boundaries. Yeah, it wasn't much of an effect. I'm not going to, I've run out of time, but I wanted to make one other thing about Ebola because it's in the title. So there was another vaccine trial started. There's a very effective Ebola vaccine there's a second one that we wanted to test in the last Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the vaccine had been rolled out, the epidemic ended, so it was never tested, but the design was in place. And they were going to use a standard test-negative design. So people were coming in with Ebola-like symptoms. They were going to ask them whether they had been vaccinated or not. They had sort of randomly been deploying the vaccine, kind of like in the way Tom described, sort of rolling it out in this area and that. But and they measured whether they had Ebola or not. But because Ebola is Ebola, if you were tested positive for Ebola, they immediately contacted all known contacts of the case. And they tested them also. And the question is, what do you do with that data? So you had the tests of the original people showing up with symptoms, but you had a whole bunch of tests for contact. And the point is, these two groups estimate different estimates because, and this is very important for COVID, the point I point out, where people showing up for asymptomatic screening, because there's this relationship here, which is, if you think of RRI, that's the relative risk for infection. We never measured that for COVID. The original trials were not designed. That's the relative risk of stopping infection happening. What we measured and what you measure in the test-negative design, typical, is relative risk for symptoms. But the vaccine may not only, even if you get a breakthrough infection, it may not prevent you from getting symptoms. In fact, that's turned out to be sort of the main purpose of the COVID vaccines. It doesn't really protect you that much. RRI isn't that different from one maybe, but RRP is quite effective. It does stop you getting symptoms. And the problem here is that the two groups of controls, the standard test-negative design measures relative risk for symptoms, however symptoms are defined, but the case contact targets relative risk of infection because you get the contacts and you test them to see, did you get infected by this contact? So they're measuring different things, but the original design, they were just throwing these together. And it gives you bias. And that's happened a lot. I'm not going to get into that. That happened a lot now in COVID test-negative design because people were not just being tested because they got symptoms. Remember the days you had to get tested to go travel? So people were showing up in clinics, get a COVID test, asymptomatically. Or they were tested because someone in their household got COVID and they thought, oh, I ought to know if I'm infected, because if I'm not, we need to sort of separate, keep apart so I don't get infected. And in many of the original test-negative designs for COVID, they were just lumping these together. And that is a problem. And you have the latest work we're doing is sort of separating those out and trying to make sense of all that, how to use that information. So this is the last slide. So what I hope I've done is say that, hey, there's a lot of statistics in here that's fun for people out there looking for projects. A lot of work going on right now, thinking about these things. Randomization, they're challenging. The test-negative design is not perfect because it's observational. So it has all the red flags, any observational study, but randomization of intervention, which is what we had under our control in dengue, really helps. And I wish we had done that more with COVID. We let people pick the vaccine. We should have been randomizing whether people got Moderna or Pfizer. We would have had a lot more information than if we'd randomized, and we didn't do that. There was far too little randomization done in COVID by and large. When it was done, as Thomas knows, it was spectacularly successful, the vaccine trials and the big platform trials for therapeutics. But we didn't do enough of it when we could. We should have been randomizing school closures and randomizing masks and doing a whole bunch of it. We didn't. Statisticians had very little voice. Now, I wanted to point out for the people who are staring at me about that as treated. The immediate thing you can think of is the randomization indicator can work as an instrument. And it's tricky though with cluster designs and binary outcomes. It's not, instrumental variables are not as easy. So that's in progress. It's tricky. And now finally, there's real challenges in using the test-negative design now for that assumption that it doesn't affect other outcomes with similar symptoms. I guarantee you now that if you've had the COVID vaccine, you're protected more against RSV and influenza than if you don't have the vaccine. Not because of anything biological. There's no impact of biologically. But if you've had the COVID vaccine, you're more likely to have had the RSV vaccine. And therefore, you're more likely not to show up at the clinic with RSV as a test negative. And that violates the fundamental assumption of the test negative design. So in designing a test negative design, you have to worry about that now in a way you didn't right at the beginning. God, the RSV vaccine is very, very recent. Thank you. I'm sorry I've run a little bit over. Thank you very much.
So I'm impressed with the effectiveness, but also impressed with the increase from 70% to 94%.
Well, there was confidence in the lower end, I remember.
Yeah.
So it's probably not necessarily that much.
It suggests that 93% effectively the data on movement of the mosquitoes.
It's also still imprecise, yeah.
Amazing.
It could be, it's probably not because you don't get 100% coverage, even in the intervention areas. You know, I showed you in the, so you're getting 80–95% will activate, you know, there is some importation of mosquitoes by wind, you know, that aren't, so you're not probably getting 100% coverage.
I suppose a little variant on the design of the, use the same kind of layout we showed is, but this confuse the mosquitoes in the central part of each of those regions. So we cut down the main effects and some of those. You showed what happened when you vary the distance in the definition of
Right.
the regions. So you could do that at the design stage. And something a bit more accurate.
I will say this, there has not been, as far as I'm aware, there's not been a single case of local transmission of dengue in northern Australia in 15 years since they opened up. Not one. They were usually, depending on the dengue, specific 10, 20, 30 cases a year. From important, you know, tourists coming in and then transmitting it locally. There hasn't been a single local. All cases are associated with travel, which is impressive. So they immediately this trial ended, they blanketed the whole of the city with the thing. And in Brazil, it didn't do all of Rio. They wouldn't let us do randomization, but the turnout rate, I think it's about 5 to 10. The relative risk is 5 or 10 more likely to be infected if you're in the areas we didn't treat. It's hugely effective intervention. That's what I said, you retire when you see a relative risk of 9. Yeah, I was kind of stunned by it.
How long from the time that the person is infected till the onset of the symptoms? How long does it take? A week?
Yeah, like 10 days.
So that's.
I mean, it's like COVID, that's 0 to 10 days. Kind of thing.
So that's how far you have to ask.
Yeah, I think it was 10 days back. Where was this kid? You know, oh, they were with their grandparents. Where do the grandparents live? So that was a little bit painstaking. That was done at the time of the treatment. They asked, even for the test negative,
Right,
where before we knew, yeah, so it was unblinded. And the family didn't know what they got dengue from, so it wasn't biased by that. But yeah, 10 days.
Then this is not so bad.
Yeah.
As a recall.
Right, for recall, right. Yeah.
You said that one of the things that you have to assume for this analysis is that the vaccine, whatever treatment approach you have doesn't impact the non-specific disease that may also show up with symptoms. But I thought you also said that Wolbachia prevents West Nile as well as, and so is that assumption not very explicitly violated?
Yeah, so any person, West Nile is not big
Or
in
whatever.
Indonesia, but chikungunya is, and Zika was potentially they were to be tested for all of this, not just for dengue or not dengue. So they were tested for dengue, they were tested for chikungunya, they were tested for Zika. If they showed up with chikungunya, they were removed from the analysis.
But one, I mean.
Well, because they're not a good test. They were removed from the analysis from the point of view of being a test negative.
But not for the.
Because they should have been detected.
Not for the effectiveness of mosquito to transmit, well, to transmit data, but not to transmit.
Well, in principle, we had planned to use those to test the effectiveness for chikungunya or Zika. It turned out there were only, I think, some less than 20, maybe less than 10 chikungunya and Zika. But yeah, those had to be removed, but they couldn't be test negatives because the intervention actually detected against those two. So
So does
I
that-
meant extra work, extra testing.
But does it impact the, sort of parameter that you're trying to estimate? Like, is that, yeah, is the interpretation of, your risk ratio impacted by, this, sort of removal of these cases?
I don't think it is in the sense that you're trying to estimate the relative risk of getting dengue versus not getting dengue associated with dengue. You just can't use them as the controls. I mean, the variants of the test negative have been around for a long time, even in cancer case control studies. You know, we all know from anyone who's done case control studies, how do you pick the controls? To get these cancer cases from a clinic, and let's take other cancer cases from the same clinic, because they should be somewhat, they're from the same catchment areas, and right? But when you do that, you have to worry, well, is the thing I have exposure to the industrial pollutants or the smoking, is that affecting this other cancer? You have to be absolutely sure, because if it does, then that's what it is. So it's the same issue really. You just can't use those people. If it is a case, like for smoking, we do a case control study, we don't want many other cancers as the controls, even though the improvements that makes sense, because smoking causes, it's associated with so many cancers, so you have to have some other people. There's that same issue, in play here. I'm worried this is going on too long. I've told you that. I'm worried about the young people. Who get to the States and- Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, I have two questions. So, one principle, so when we're doing test negative design, is it basically a limitation of the design that we can really only learn the odds ratio? And then under some assumption that approximates the relative risk, that's the sampling limit which we're able to identify. And, you know, if so, you know, if we really want to get to the relative risk, and we don't have the approximation of small, incidents. What do we do? I mean, can we bring in other?
You can't get the risk difference of this design.
We can, we
You can't. You can't get the relative. You're not getting the relative ratio. Even though you're using.
are or not?
You're not. You're
But
using
do
the
we get
empirical
the
odds ratio, but it doesn't estimate the population odds ratio. It estimates the population relative risk. The same as the case cohort something like that. You don't need any assumption that the risk is low. It's not an approximation. You actually get, the estimate is the relative risk. I'm saying that right for case cohorts on them.
It would be sample odds ratio.
Estimates, but yeah, very confusing for students, right? You go through all this stuff, you know, the odds ratio estimates the population odds ratio. And that's a rough approximation of the relative risk when the disease is there. You just spent 2 or 3 lectures on that, and then you introduce a case cohort plan because of this guy. And you say, here's the odds ratio. Well, it doesn't estimate, it estimates the relative risk, and you lost the whole concept, but they don't get that. The same empirical statistical object, because of the sampling, estimates something different. And it estimates the relative risk without any assumption of rarity.
There's no regression model. I mean,
You can do a model of regression, but the coefficient doesn't estimate the odds rate.
what about the risk features?
It doesn't get it, you can't get it with the test negative. You think about that A over NI and
Yeah,
D over N. You can't get that. The only trick that makes that, what is that ratio? But you don't get that, so you can't, other than if you introduce some, you know, like all those tricks, if you know something about the baseline risk.
and are those papers of very, you know those graphs, are they getting at the risk difference and
No, they're getting it. Too.
at the risk?
Yeah, yeah. And it's a little bit confusing because part of what's going on in the test negative design is not really explained by the causal diagram. It's the same thing that in a case control study. If you look at a causal diagram in the case control studies, you think you're screwed. You can't get an estimate. Why can I get we've been saying for years, you can ask for the authors. That's because of a cancellation of effects that the causal diagram doesn't really immediately show. And that's the same thing really going on here a little bit. It's a bit confusing to students. If you try and teach them to use causal diagrams as if it tells you everything, they don't quite. And they don't get, there's a cancellation going on here with the collider bias for the selection. And it's the same thing, akin to what's going on in case control studies. And so that's not what their paper is about, actually. It's more about, are you really getting rid of healthcare seeking? Yeah.
I think we are over time.
Okay, real quick. So lethal vaccine, as I understand, doesn't prevent transmission. It prevents the sequelae symptoms. In HIV, we don't have a vaccine, but we do have antiretrovirals, and we can suppress viral load and prevent transmission. So lovely to have a vaccine that does both, and suppress viral load and prevent the sequelae and transmission. And with your Slovakia approach, when you're basically putting the intervention out to the population, your 77% efficacy could be a combination of both if it's doing both. Because it could be, if I'm having suppression, not only am I going to have less symptoms, but the mosquitoes aren't going to bite me and transmit to you. So you could be seeing part of both types of effects.
You could be. Yeah, you're getting that relative risk of symptoms because the mixture of both.
I mean, it's the right answer you want. You want the direct and indirect effects.
It's a public health answer. You'd like to know, can I reduce the healthcare burden by this intervention? But you can't distinguish the two. But the bit I said at the very end where you get asymptomatic screening, it's getting the relative risk of infection.
Yeah.
And if you have both sources, you can at least start to compare. Is there any evidence that there's, how much is one and how much like the other?
For our COVID vaccines, we were individual randomizations. I don't think we missed much because I think the effect was predominantly preventing my symptoms, not my transmission.
And the interesting thing about the Ebola design, which they didn't realize at the time, is that you get contact cases. So that testing contacts and they're asymptomatic is getting the relative risk of infection. But you also get their vaccination status and the vaccination status of the source where they got the infection if they are infected. So you can test whether the vaccination reduced the risk of transmission to a contact. Which is interesting. We postulated that being true for COVID. I don't know if it's known to be true or not, but we sort of think it's true. But that you can get from that hybrid design. So it's challenging statistically, but it has the potential to have more interesting questions answered.
Sorry to interrupt this interview.
No,
But then, let's thank you again for the wonderful talk.